We all want our children to have every opportunity to succeed in life. We want them to be the smartest, the most talented, the most athletic. And that's why it can be heartbreaking when we learn that our child has a learning difference. My guest here today is Dr. Matthew Howson. He is the founder of the Howson Center located in North Texas. Dr. Howson and his clinical team provide psychoeducational and psychological assessments, as well as providing therapy for parents and children. He's here today to talk with us about the opportunities available for helping your child succeed when they have a learning difference. I first got to know Dr. Howson several years ago as a parent, and it is my privilege to welcome him to the show today.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and talk about one of my favorite things to talk about.
Excellent. Well, I used the term learning differences in that intro. Is that the right phrase? Is that the right term to use when our child has something different in their learning?
I think it's a good starting place. Learning differences implies, that a child's in school and we're seeing differences in their learning. Technically, when we do an assessment, we're looking more at learning disabilities. And so the way that we think about the difference between those two things is with a learning disability, you're seeing a discrepancy in what you would expect based on a child's intellectual capacities or educational opportunities they've had. You're seeing discrepancy that's more than what's expected. And the way that we get at that is we look at, statistical deviations from what's expected. So I think that maybe can help listeners understand the difference between a difference and a disability.
So how early are learning disabilities detectable in young children?
It's a really common question, and my perspective on it is the earlier the better. Now, it's very difficult to be definitive with diagnosis of dyslexia prior to, second semester of kindergarten or first semester of first grade, because there's different developmental trajectories that children are on. However, we know so much about family history and the heritability of learning disabilities. And I tell families, if you're worried about a child, bring them in. We can do some screening measures so we don't have to spend a lot of time and a lot of money looking at a full evaluation, but we can start with speech language therapy. We can start with occupational therapy with 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds so that we're trying to mitigate the frustration that early learners experience when there is a difference in their motor system or their language system. It's those underlying areas that may predispose them to a future diagnosis of a learning disability. And so what we think about is what's called RTI, or response to intervention. We want to take children who have vulnerability as early as we can, give them intervention, and then at that point, we want to come back and monitor their progress over time.
So how is it that that children come to you? I mean, is it generally a parent noticing something different, or maybe a pediatrician, or
all of those are areas where it's commonly teachers. We have really nice relationships that we've established in the Dallas area with both private and public schools, where a teacher may text me or they may call me and say, "Hey, I have this child. This is what I'm seeing. What do you think?" But I would say it's most commonly for learning issues, it comes from teachers. And then for attention or social communication differences, it would be a pediatrician or a parent who's saying, "I'm worried about the way my child's relating socially. I'm worried about self-control and overactivity." And it's at that point that we want to bring the family in without the child and do a good case history and look at symptoms and look at sleep and look at exercise. I kind of joke a lot of times and say I've treated more children with attention problems by changing their sleep than by any other, methods such as medication.
Well, that's interesting. I definitely want to come back and talk more about ADD and
Sure.
about sleep and other things.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back. When we talk about the assessment process, it can be kind of scary. I know when when a teacher says, "I think it might be time," and so how does psychoeducational testing differ from maybe like a full psychological analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So both of those two assessments starts with the parents and sitting down and just knowing family history, vulnerabilities for different learning issues. That's usually about an hour appointment. What I think is really important, it's been difficult with COVID, like a lot of things, but I think of going to see the student at school. And so we like to go and do a classroom observation And that's really where we've gotten the family's perspective. Now I want to hear the teacher's perspective. I just feel teachers are invaluable resources when I'm doing an assessment because they really know that student. We're spending 6 to 10 hours with a child, but they're with a child every day. So I want to know from teachers. In addition to the school visit, we'll go and have teachers and parents fill out questionnaires. And these are norm-based questionnaires that look at executive function skills, are they within range or outside of the range? And then it proceeds to one-on-one testing with the child where we'll do cognitive or intellectual testing, and we're looking at verbal abilities, visual spatial skills. We look at working memory and remote memory. We look a lot at language with young children. 50% of children who have dyslexia also have a language processing disorder. And so these are children that as they get older, they may have difficulty with reading comprehension if you don't take care of some of those underlying language processing weaknesses. We'll then go to the academic part where we'll look at reading decoding and reading fluency and reading comprehension. We'll look at math, word problems versus math calculation versus time tests. The time test is important because a lot of children have cognitive processing disorders where they're just much slower than you would expect given how high level they can process. So they may be very good at conceptualizing and telling you how two words are alike or putting blocks together, but they're very slow in terms of just their pace or tempo. During the latter part of the assessment, we do computer measures of sustained attention, and then we do the psychological part. It's a little bit more than a screening where we talk to the children, we have them fill out rating forms, and that kind of rounds out a psychoeducational evaluation when we meet with parents and go through the results. The psychological piece is everything I said, plus sometimes we'll use much more intensive psychological assessments, projective tests, self-report personality questionnaires. That's usually for middle school and high school kids.
So, having gone through the process, I know when you get the results back, it really is like a key to unlocking your child's strengths and where their areas of challenge will be. For parents, if it's not being detected, if a teacher isn't suggesting there's a problem, is it still worthwhile to have an assessment done?
I think I like sports. I played sports when I was younger, and I like watching sports. And so I kind of think about what we do like college athletes after they graduate from college and they want to go to the NFL, they go to the combine. And so I feel like our testing is about going through these different measures and looking at not how high you can jump or how fast you can run, but what are your different assets. And so rather than it being a diagnostic test just for the purpose of getting to diagnosis, I want to know a student's profile. When I say profile, we want to know what's stamina. When does that student put his head on the desk and say, gosh, I'm tired? We have norms when we do that, and we put breaks in just to prevent fatigue. But if a child's getting fatigued very quickly in our office, it's happening at the kitchen table after school. And so I think that's the part where having a diagnostic team where you can look at both the educational part, but also the psychological part allows for a much more richer profile. And it's with that profile that we can make recommendations of, even though we have a very bright student developmentally, they may not be ready for that accelerated school. And so, we say that some students are accelerated ready in first grade and some others aren't ready to go to, the school that teaches 1 or 2 standard deviations above the mean until they're in middle school or high school. They're just not developmentally ready to work that hard.
And so that doesn't mean that they won't be. It just is really trying to tailor the education experience to meet their needs.
My favorite word is yet.
Yet.
Right? We basically say, we see these capacities, but we may not yet be ready for, tag, or we may not quite be ready for this accelerated high school.
So you're looking at gifted as well as learning challenges?
Yeah, we really look at learners across the spectrum. I always have kind of a bell curve in my mind, and I'm saying this student's a 50th percentile learner, or this student's an 84th percentile learner, which is 1 standard deviation above the mean, or a 98th percentile. And then we also have students who struggle a little bit more. And so it's that delta between their higher end scores and their lower end scores that I'm really interested in, because that tells me a lot about what we do developmentally. Do we gear schooling based on what their social emotional stamina needs are, or do we gear their program based on their academic strengths or weaknesses?
One of the things I hear from my clients, and so, obviously we're working in a divorce situation or a separated parent situation. When one of the other parents wants to have the child assessed, is a concern over diagnosis or labeling the child.
Sure.
What is your response to that? What should parents be thinking about when it comes to assessment and the possibility of those labels?
I think it's a legitimate concern. I mean, they're especially in mental health. I mean, a lot of times diagnoses have been used for unintended or even negative purposes. And so I joke and say, I think diagnoses are interested in insurance companies, but I'm really interested in profiles. And so when we have that, and a lot of that we understand, from either parent, whether married or going through divorce or divorced, it's fear-based and it's worry-based. I mean, I think the essence of parenting is wanting to do the best. I've never met a parent who didn't want to do the best, even though their actions may not have been the best, but their desire was.
Right.
And so their fear a lot of times does interfere with maybe wanting the assessment. And so I think it's important just to talk to that parent and say, here's what's going to happen to the student. Kids almost always love coming in. They like getting goldfish or they like individual attention from an adult. So it's rarely the child that comes in and who has a negative time. But we want to educate the parents and help them to understand through this process, we'll come up with a profile, and then that can then help you make informed decisions in terms of what's the right intervention. Do we need a really intensive reading tutor, or do we just need someone who's working on academic confidence? So the testing's pretty good about telling us those more nuanced decisions that people can spend lots of time and energy arguing with each other over. We have the data. Let's just do the data.
Yeah.
And then, as parents, you can make really good informed decisions.
So the other question that I have has to do with this idea that, every child should be succeeding at a high level.
Yeah.
And really, that's not true. To be a successful person, you don't have to have the highest IQ. You don't have to be
Absolutely.
performing, right? So how do you help parents kind of navigate that when maybe a child comes back with scores that are much lower than the parent was expecting?
It happens. And, that's the benefit of being a psychologist who's practiced 25 years and had the benefit of, my wife's a psychologist, Wells is, and we have 4 children.
Your own laboratory.
Yeah, exactly. and it is a laboratory, but we've just learned, and I've learned personally that, children, I've seen my oldest Elizabeth's friends, they went to a whole range of colleges. They're sophomores now, and we see that their outcomes are so dependent on work ethic, grit, persistence, distress tolerance. And so, I never have parents say, what's my child's distress tolerance index? But they always say, what's their IQ? IQ is important, but what we know from all the research is people who can handle distress and can show grit and persistence are going to be successful. And so a really important thing, and I haven't figured it out yet, but I want to come up with a number that I could say, like an IQ number, to parents and say their grit number is this. And I think it would be a lot more reassuring for parents. Until I or someone much smarter than me comes up with that, I think it's important for parents to understand that if your children are mentally healthy, if they're sleeping well, if they're exercising, if they're, if they have some form of faith that's guiding them, if they're goal directed and they have good adults around them, we all become who we're going to become, who we're going to be.
And so does that, I remember when we were deciding what school, it was like the weight of the decision. Am I was going to get it wrong?
Yeah.
And it felt at the time like it was an intractable decision.
Yeah.
Like once you decide that path, then you can't make any other choices.
Yeah.
And so how do you counsel parents in terms of trying to decide what is going to be the best fit option for a child?
Sometimes I'll say to parents, this student is a 1 to 3 school kid. The school that's right for a kindergartner may not be right for a 9th grader. And so that's, again, gets at that developmental perspective that we take when we do an assessment of, we're taking a snapshot of a student at that point in time. And we're trying to take that snapshot and make it into a video that's predictive. And sometimes you can't do that because the next time you test them, hopefully within 3 years, those two pictures may look different. And then that totally changes your trajectory. And so some of my favorite children to work with are the ones who are 3 and 4 years old. And we say, okay, here's the plan for pre-K. And we do that, and then we're going to test right before kindergarten, and then we'll know what we do there, public or private, specialty, specialized services through public or private school, or more typical. And that for me is fun and engaging. For parents, it's really anxiety provoking. But I think for me, it's fun to then make predictions and say, this is where we want to be. And a lot of times it works out because we have, parents who are following good advice, and, we have experience. We don't know, we don't have a crystal ball, but the data that we get through these assessments, because we're asking teachers and we're seeing the child and we're talking to parents, we can take that information and assimilate it so that we hopefully can be a little bit better than, other parents in the carpool line about which school is the best.
I love that. And it is super helpful. And I think that idea that this could be a 1 to 3 school child, that just because you set out on a path doesn't mean you're going to have to change.
Well, and I think parents now, especially, with the pandemic, are just anxious. And, in Texas, we have lots of families moving from other areas. And so it feels more competitive. I think it is more competitive. So there's that rush to get into that school and not have to deal with this awful admissions process for families who are private school, driven, or even families that are in magnet schools and public school. So it's just a more anxiety provoking time.
It absolutely is. I want to go back and touch on grit real quick, because I would imagine that is something that is malleable and can absolutely be influenced through a child's life.
Absolutely.
How can parents really help encourage the development of grit in their child?
That's a great question. And, when I think of grit, I think what's the precursor to it, which is distress tolerance. In order to be able to persevere through difficult times, one has to be able to regulate emotion. And I think that helping parents to understand that, temperament drives so much of emotional regulation, and usually parents who get thrown off kilter easily have children who get thrown off kilter easily. And so we want to make sure, if we're starting at the earliest ages, that we focus on attachment, we focus on sleep, and we focus on predictable structures and the ability to soothe the child. And so being parents who are emotional thermostats rather than emotional thermometers, there's a big difference in terms of helping your child to regulate. And as children are able to regulate their emotions, then they get better when they're losing in a soccer game and they're crying and they're upset, and their coach can go and not yell at them and kind of be a thermometer with them, but bring them to the sideline, help them to get regulated and saying, look, we're going to be better. This is a hard game. Then that builds grit and distress tolerance. So I think grit is a marathon, and distress tolerance is kind of the daily workouts.
So what I hear you saying is it's important for our children to experience some stress in their lives, some distress.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, stress, we all get overwhelmed. I think of it on a 10-point scale, and we all get into 7 and 8 and 9 10s of emotion where we yell and cry and scream, and we're in our limbic system, which is our lower brain, our downstairs brain. We have to help children get back into their upstairs brain where they can start thinking and reasoning. And so I think that's just an important area in parenting, is just helping parents understand the neuroscience of emotion. And as we understand how emotion works, then I think we can get to these higher level goals of grit and emotional intelligence.
Love that. I want to switch a little bit and talk about kind of the older children that you're seeing, the teenagers. What in terms of like depression and anxiety, what are our teens experiencing these days?
I feel like 2 years ago, we were seeing rates of anxiety and depression really higher in teenage populations. And then the pandemic came and everything doubled. So we were already high, and then it just doubled. So teenagers lost the ability to connect with their primary sources of support during the pandemic, which were their friends.
Not their parents.
Not their parents. And that's normal,
Yeah.
right? And so I think we just saw teenagers really kind of got gut punched emotionally. And so I feel like, it's been a real struggle for that age group. And we have periods where we come out of lockdowns and mask mandates, and then we go back into it. And so I think it's that topsy-turvy nature of just dealing with a pandemic that's been difficult for everybody, underneath a more contentious, just everything environment where everyone's more emotional and everyone's more anxious. And so I feel like the important thing for teenagers, right now is just parents connecting with them and basically saying, I get it, it's been hard, how can we, work through this? But those rates have really gone up quite a bit during the last 2 years.
So another issue that I see that comes up quite a bit has to do with the use of medication. And so medication, whether it's depression and anxiety or whether it's like ADD and focus, what are some guidelines that you use to help parents understand when medication is useful or other remedies are better?
Yeah, I think that's great. The way that, again, when you look at things from a neuroscience perspective, we know what a calm brain is like, and we know what a dysregulated brain is. And so, first of all, when we speak about medicine, most people think about attention deficit medicine. Those medicines are called stimulant medications. And very, very simply put, what they do is they activate a neurotransmitter. It's called dopamine. And when our brain gets dopamine, it's more alert. The analogy I use a lot of times for families is you're driving on a long trip and you're just really bored and you start to get underactivated and your brain waves slow down, you get and then someone honks at you and you get a surge of adrenaline and, just kind of a neurotransmitter boost. And then your dopamine's activating, all of a sudden you're focusing better and doing better. So those medicines are very effective. They're 70 to 85% effective if you've been accurately diagnosed. So for attention disorder medicines, we find that if a student's struggling, that intervention, as well as sleep, as well as exercise, as well as structure, and cognitive behavior therapy is the gold standard. But not every child who has an attention problem needs that level of intervention. So I think that's where it starts with a good assessment and a good idea of what's going on, so that then parents can be educated about what's the effectiveness of this or what's the effectiveness of that. If you go onto the internet and you Google, treatment for ADHD, there's a lot of things, and all of those things work about 30% effectively. The placebo response rate is 30%. And so parents will say, well, we're trying, fill in your favorite, supplement. And I say, how's it working? And a third of them, a little less than a third, but 30% of them are going to say it's really effective. Well, the standard is it 70 to 85% effective? That is the treatment for attention deficit. Interesting research on medicines that we use to treat anxiety and depression. They're called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We have found through studies that were actually done here at Children's Medical Center in UT Southwestern, is we found that when we treat depression in children with those medicines for 9 to 12 months, it significantly reduces the risk of relapse as they get older. So those medicines almost seem to be helping the brain recalibrate those neurotransmitter systems that are dysregulated. And it's really pretty cool research. That's not true for ADHD medicines, but we're finding some research that if you treat depression younger and quicker and more earlier, then you can reduce the risk of relapse as children mature and the brain gets older.
That's really interesting.
It's new. It's new research. It's pretty cool.
I hadn't heard that. That is one of the things, just having raised teenagers and still raising teenagers, that it seems right now is that the teenagers are very, very aware of depression. I think there's a lot of social media hype about depression. I mean, there's good information out there. But how do you know if your child's really actually kind of struggling with depression, or if they're just falling in with all their other with all the
Yeah,
peers.
it's hard. I mean, I think we have that. We think that we're seeing that around other aspects of mental health, identity and gender, and a lot of these things. Children are having and adolescents are having to filter through that. I think that's again where your relationship with your child is important in helping them to understand that, you know what, we all have days. Monday's a common day where we feel a little under motivated, but we can get ourselves up. Clinical depression, when you're really, concerned, is when the most common symptom in adolescence is not sadness, it's irritability. So that's hard to tell because adolescents are often irritable. But if you have irritability, drop in grades, loss of motivation, sleep changes, appetite changes, children who just no longer want to go out and see their friends, that's time to go in and speak to your pediatrician or come and see a psychologist.
Great information. So you've mentioned sleep a lot during our time together so far.
Mm-hmm.
What role does sleep play in our children, and why is it so important?
I mean, sleep is to your iPhone what a charger is, right? I mean, if you're not getting the right amount, then you're going into the day with an uncharged battery, and as a result, you're going to be more reactive, be more unfocused. And so, children under 6 need 12 hours of sleep. That's 7 o'clock to 7 o'clock.
And and what about teenagers? How much?
Teenagers, 9 hours and 20 minutes. There was a study that showed if kids could get 9 hours and 20 minutes, the range is 8 to 9 hours for teenagers.
Okay. I'm going to go home and tell my children,
9 hours,
Dr. House said
minutes.
you have to be in bed by
Not
8.
a minute more or a minute less. No, but interesting research. But, if we can, I just tell teenagers, think of 8 as your minimum.
Mm-hmm.
They are all underslept. And as a parent, you can't make someone eat something they don't want to eat, and you can't make someone sleep. You just want to educate them. And when I've gotten under 8 hours, I can feel it the next day. Mm-hmm. And then I just have to auto-regulate. So sometimes we have to learn the hard way.
And the lack of sleep, how does that show up? I mean, I kind of know the answer to that,
but it's multiple pathways. Yeah. I mean, you're just not the best version of yourself, mm-hmm. is what I tell teenagers. And so if they're coming in and they're, concerned about their grades or concerned about not making as many baskets in the game or whatever, I can say, well, let's try to get you optimized. Let's look at what you're eating, the fuel you're putting in the body, the fuel you're getting through sleep. Because what happens when we don't sleep enough is we're just not giving our brain an opportunity to regenerate, rest, and build neurotransmitters to the level that they need to be.
And really function. So as we kind of come, I don't want to leave our time without talking about COVID and talking about distance education. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that occurs to me as we're talking through this are devices, right? I mean, as a parent, I tried to minimize devices, and then COVID happened, mm-hmm. and everybody's on their devices mm-hmm. all the time. Mm-hmm. What impact are you seeing in the kiddos that you're taking, evaluating and mm-hmm. treating in general?
Anytime you have individuals who overdo anything, whether they overdo gambling or they overdo anything that's negative for their brain, they almost go into, when you take that desired activity away, they've got high amounts of neurotransmitters pumping through their brain, and then they go through it, and there's an immediate dip in mood. Mm-hmm. And so that's the irritability when a 5 or a 6-year-old, you take their iPad away and they throw a fit. And so across the age spectrum, I think it's important with the youngest children. Some children don't need to be on, media. We're getting research that's saying just for some children, their brains can't take it. Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing these behavioral issues that come up. For teenagers in general, the way that I think about this, Jennifer, is what is the most proactive way you can work with them? And that's a schedule. So you come home, you've been at school all day, get on your iPad, check out, look at your YouTube videos that you like to, give yourself a time limit, and then go and do your thing. So I think it's important we all do it. We all, whether it's your favorite news outlet or your favorite YouTuber, we all do that as a means to rest and relax. But if we have a schedule we have to get back to, it prevents us from just staying in that world. And I think that was what was hard during COVID is, we all got sophisticated in having the person we were talking to and that secondary device or secondary thing that we could look at, just because the social strictures against doing so weren't as as apparent in those situations.
Well, and it really became a means to having some connection
Exactly.
with the outside world.
That's
so
right.
I know, like our extracurricular activities were online via Zoom.
Yeah, and so I think that's what's difficult, and just there's something therapeutic about being in relationship with someone, and when you put a medium in between that, that's a computer screen. It's connection, but it's not the type of connection that involves the sensory experience of being with someone and all the things that go along with it. It's just much richer. And so I think that, the ingredients were there, but it was a very bland diet of social interaction.
Yeah. And what are you seeing in terms of the learning that happened? Are there big gaps that we're having to make up for now? And
some families that are testing for private schools right now, there's an independent school entrance exam, and all the scores are lower than they've been in time past. And we're seeing it on the STAR test. So we are seeing learning loss and the consequences of it, because even as good as or bad as we thought we were as parents, we're not professional teachers. And so I think it's going to, there is going to be a ripple effect that comes along with COVID that we're already seeing in test scores.
And how can I help my child then kind of fill in the gap? Is that extra tutoring to make up? Do we just pile more on them to try and catch up? Or
I just think that we have to be patient. We have to collectively understand that this is, it's a setback, that if we, return to what we're doing, getting kids in school, letting teachers, deal with learning and not some of the ancillary things that are being talked about in schools right now, they're going to get where they eventually need to get.
And that includes not only academically, but the social part of it too, right?
Some kids will need tutoring, but I really want to be reluctant to say, more tutor, just because I think I see more kids who are over-tutored than under-tutored, which worries me more for their social emotional development than for anything else.
When, since you brought up tutoring, when is tutoring a good idea? When is it just, more pressure?
The person, outside of doing an evaluation, the person who has the best read on that is your child's teacher. These are professionals who are with your child every day. And if they say you need tutoring for your child, get tutoring. If they say, I don't think so, I would listen to them.
So just because all the friends are doing tutoring doesn't mean we have to do tutoring.
Yeah, absolutely not.
Excellent. I know you also provide therapy. And so can you talk a little bit about the therapy that the House and Center is doing with families?
Yeah, I feel lucky. I feel like my day is kind of a different day. I meet with parents, and then we work with young children, and then after school, kids will come in, and we provide a range of therapy. So for children who have social communication differences, we have speech language pathologists that are really expert in developing, eye contact and social and emotional reciprocity. Or just traditional speech language intervention. Most of the counselors do a form of therapy called cognitive behavior therapy, which focuses on the relationship between the person's thoughts, their feelings, and their actions. I really like family therapy for adolescents, because a lot of times it's nice when there is a parent-child conflict to come in as a family and do a lot of problem solving and working with them. So therapy can take so many different forms, and I think what's important is having the right intervention that's geared for the right student. So whether it's a social intervention, an anxious, depression type intervention, or if it's academic, a lot of kids need therapy for their executive function skills. These are things like organizing and planning and self-monitoring, So those are just different types of interventions that we have available at the Housing Center.
And I know in the past you've done, like during the summer, you've done camps for things like the executive functioning and getting organized.
We're
Are you
getting
still doing
geared
this?
up for that this summer. That was difficult. It's been difficult, you
Yeah.
know, anything social, but we're getting geared up to do more executive function camps. And one of the clinicians that we have, she and her husband are doing parent training series that's virtual, looking at the neuroscience behind ADHD and autism spectrum. So there's just a lot of services that are available for families who are wanting help.
That is great. What, as we kind of wrap up our time today, what message of hope do you have for families who have a child who's really struggling? And maybe it's emotional or educational learning differences.
You know, I think the thing I notice the most, Jennifer, in my work is the brain is built to get better, you know, the older we live to a certain point, right? But I would just say with identifying, you know, learning issues, there's a lot of resources that are available for students. The expectation is each child that's diagnosed and kind of appropriately given the right, we get the right profile and have a plan, those children all go on to do the things that they're supposed to, whether that's go to college or start working and then go back to college or, you know, start their own businesses. I'm just so optimistic about child development when we understand what the vulnerabilities are to that normal development. If you put the guardrails up at the right times, children just soar.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is really helpful for me as a parent and as a professional.
It's been fun. It feels like we've been talking 5 minutes. I know it's longer, but it's been great.
It has been great. If you want to learn more about Dr. Housen or the Housen Center, we will include links to his website below. And I hope you'll reach out if you need assessment for your child. Thank you so much.